Hello lovelies, today we're going to talk about Tales from the Loop. Now, this has been on my radar for quite some time, thinking about picking it up, but I couldn't really justify the cost and so on for some time until I'd saved up a bit of money. And then the UK Games Expo fuss, which is actually about things from the Flood, gave me the final kick to pick it up, even though people have been saying, oh, you should check this out. Now, I've written some material for some games that is quite similar in some ways, so I'm going to do a lot of referencing to my own work because there's similarities in approach and so on. This isn't necessarily to pimp my own material, but just, you know, these are the things that leapt out at me. If you want to see my take on a kids on bikes sort of game, that's called Forever Summer, and it's available at the Chronicle City store on DriveThruRPG. Tales from the Loop falls somewhere just short of Stranger Things. Stranger Things has gotten darker in tone, and there's been more violence and body horror and nastiness and so on in that than you'll find in this. Things from the Flood is a little bit more adult, a little bit more brutal, and yeah, I'll review that separately at some point. But let's get into it. I mean, it's not just an 80s game, it's not just a kids on bikes game, it's an alternate history and it's a retrofuture, so in a lot of ways it's how people in the 80s saw the future. If you go and look at some sort of kids accessible things to come in the future books, like Cities of the Future is the one that really leapt out to me. If you look at the style and the way in which NASA and various other groups were looking towards the future, that'll give you more art resources and more hooks into this. So look at 80s stuff about the future if you want stuff to inspire your Tales from the Loop. Now, it's illustrated by Simon Stolberg, I think I'm pronouncing that right, we'll just call him Simon, and it has a very strong Nordic influence, and if you don't set it in the Nordic setting, I think you're going to be missing out on a lot. So the standard setting is Sweden, based around this island and based around this particle accelerator that was built in the 60s, and that has kind of broken reality to an extent and allowed a whole bunch of new and weird technology to emerge. It's not the only source of the weird advances and so on, but it's one of them, and your characters, your kids, live in reasonably close proximity to that, and that's responsible for a lot of the weirdness and a site of a lot of experimentation and so on. So in a way, it's like Baby's First Stalker or The Roadside Picnic with Rusks. It has that kind of weirdness underlying it all. And if you don't use the Nordic setting, like I said, then I think you're going to be missing out on something different and interesting and important in a lot of ways. We don't see a lot of material other than LARPs really coming out of that area. And yeah, it's mostly written by people from there. The layout is nice. It is reminiscent of the 80s and some of the 80s nostalgia games and things that we've seen lately, in the choice of colours and so on. One thing I found a little bit disappointing is that the paper quality is quite rough, and it tends to flatten Simon's images, so they're not really shown to their full effect. You would need more expensive, glossy, photograph type art book paper to really have that happen, which would have driven the price up, but it is a pity. So it's worth looking up Simon's work online if you want to get the full effect of his art, because this just adds a layer of grain, flattens the colours out, and just it doesn't present it to its fullest. You got your basic intro and so on, D6s. These custom ones, they're just six-sided dice, but you know, they look quite nice. Really, you don't need them. You just need six-sided dice. So grab a pack of whatever looks good to you. You can get some nice, fairly cheap sort of black and green ones that look like old digital readouts, which would work for this as well, I think, especially if you're going for a darker, more cyberpunky sort of tone for it. Yeah, explanations on role-playing, like you always do. That might be worthwhile in this instance. This might be someone's first RPG if they're really into the art and so on. Principles. Now, this is similar to what I put together for actual fucking monsters. In fact, I had the 5 pillars, which are strong suggestions on how you should run the game, and Tales from the Loop has its own 6 though. Your hometown is full of strange and fantastic things, is number 1. Everyday life is dull and unforgiving, is number 2. Adults are out of reach and out of touch, is number 3. The land of the loop is dangerous, but kids will not die, is number 4. The game is played scene by scene, is number 5. And the world is described collaboratively. Most of that's pretty self-explanatory. And when they say your hometown, it's because they suggest that you can move the loop or have another loop wherever it is you happen to want one. This is kind of tapping into the way presentation occurred in a lot of 80s movies, like Explorers, for example, where in their regular everyday life things are hectic or difficult, or they're bullied or whatever, and then the encounter with the fantastic allows them to find something new or different or worthwhile about themselves. So, it's all in keeping with the kind of mood that they're trying to reach. And obviously, these are just suggestions that you don't need to follow. Particularly, keeping the adults out of the loop, because the first thing a kid does, usually when they get in trouble, is go to the mum and dad, right? So if you want to cut that off and say, the adults are busy, they don't believe you, whatever else. Though in this world, it's harder to justify adults not believing you because the world is undeniably strange and different. Now, kids will not die. What if they throw themselves off a cliff onto rocks? I don't think that should be quite so definitive. I think you should be able to die in certain egregious circumstances, but the aim of the game should not be to kill the players, which it can be forgiven for being mistaken for in quite a few other games. Things from the Flood is a little bit darker and has expanded rules. So if you wanted to play a darker, more Stranger Things-like campaign here, where people do die and get into trouble, then you could just port the rules over from that, and that shouldn't be a problem. Most of this you don't really need to go into detail on, but the world is described collaboratively. Now, this is a narrativist line. That kind of shared control and so on is more popular in the Nordic LARPs, which is the only real Nordic experience and interaction I have, which is a shame. So that seems to come from that, but it's also presented here in not the same way that it is in a lot of story games. It's not handing over narrative control to the players. It is more collaborating with the players or tapping into the players for suggestions and content and things like that, which is how a lot of games masters act anyway, if you're of that sort of bent, and as a way of taking the strain off the games master. I mean, a good games master is improvisational, right? So they will react to what players do, to what players say, to what they seem to want, what they respond to, and so on, which is a kind of implicit way of sharing narrative control. Here it's more explicit, so you can ask the players, what's your school like? What's the teacher like? What's the mood of the house when you get home? Yeah, things like that. So it's encouraging you to invite the players to contribute and take some of the load, which is a nicer way of going about it. It's narrativism without necessarily having the same kind of drawbacks that a lot of narrativist mechanics have. Now, this is alternate history and retrofuture, and the art is all about that. You see the past in terms of 80s cars and clothing and design style and so on, coupled with the future in terms of robotics, flying ships, things like that. So things are very different. There are genuine robots, for example. There are anti-gravity ships that ply various routes. And all of this is common and understood and accepted and it's just every day. So you have to spend some time, I think, establishing the mood that a lot of these things are just normal and everyday in this context. One nice little touch they have is these little lists of things like movies that were popular in the 80s, like Ghostbusters, Top Gun, Return of the Jedi, The Goonies, E.T., Breakfast Club, Back to the Future, Stand By Me, Gremlins, The Karate Kid, stuff like that. So, you know, you could have them on mute in the background to help establish the mood, or watch one first, or draw inspiration from those while you're writing your games. And I guess a lot of people playing now never directly experienced the 80s in any way. So I feel old, but that makes that feel quite useful. Making playlists of 80s music would also be a good way to go. And, you know, that was when we saw quite a lot of instrumental and experimental electronic music that would fit, like the Blade Runner soundtrack would work quite well. Vangelis. Or Tubular Bells, that's more 70s, I guess. Or was it 80s? Never mind. Anyway, you know the kind of thing. Music with lyrics tends to interrupt and get in the way of play, but instrumental stuff is all good. Then they talk about the loop and the effects that's had, the other innovations. It's like in the 50s, Soviet scientists discovered the essentially anti-gravity effect. It's more to do with magnetism. The first particle accelerator was built. A Japanese company cracked robotics somehow. It's never really explained, but I guess kids wouldn't really understand. The Swedish particle accelerators built. Civilian robots enter service in the 70s, and military robots. It's not a huge amount of detail, but then kids wouldn't know a huge amount of detail. So, you know, if you're not familiar with Sweden or the Nordic countries at all, then this is an invaluable guide to what life was like there in the 80s. Some peculiarities that I certainly wasn't particularly aware of, and the kind of technology, what people did for fun. You know, it's a useful primer, and something that probably more games that are set historically or geographically could do with having sort of what is everyday life like, what things are available, what do people do for fun, what are the peculiarities and quirks of the place that you live, though it can be hard to know those without someone from outside you know, coming through to you. A few other sort of elements like energy companies, some more detail about the loop, how big it is, what it does, what the effects are, and so on, what technology is available to civilians versus the military. I don't want to go into too much detail because here and there's spoilers if you're planning to play a game, but it is all there. You've got explanations as if it was adverts, again in a very 80s style. Then, just as we've had the background for the Swedish loop, we have background for the American loop in Boulder, and you know what TV shows were big in the States, talking about tabletop RPGs. So you might have a game in a game, very meta. You know what kids did in the 80s in the States, the differences between that and Europe, a few locations and ideas. We've got a map like we've got on the frontispiece for the Boulder City loop and so forth. I think people are much more familiar with the States thanks to American cultural imperialism, but it's still useful information there. Again, I don't want to get into too much detail because here be spoilers to an extent. Now we get to our characters. I quite like to place character generation fairly early in a book because that's kind of like the first thing that the majority of people want to look at because they're players. They want to see what kind of characters they can play. And seeing the characters also gives you an insight into the system, which is useful for games masters. So you have kids. They conform to various archetypes. You can choose your type. You can decide your age from 10 to 15. I think I would allow people to go younger if they really wanted to, but if younger than 10, I would probably boost up the luck points a bit more. You get to distribute a number of points equal to your age in your various attributes, 1 to 5 points in each. You determine your luck, which is 15 minus your age. So if you're 15, you're shit out of luck. Reminds me of my teenage years. 10 points in skills. You can only take up to level 3 in the key skills of your type and other skills at 1. So you're quite restricted by archetype, which is something I don't like. I would probably open that up some and make it so you didn't have to conform to a particular stereotype. You choose an iconic item, you choose a problem that you have, you pick a drive, which is what propels you forward, what's your motivation. Pick a pride, something that can be pricked. Define your relationship to the other kids and to important NPCs. Select an anchor, that's someone close to you. Give your name, give your short description, choose your favourite song. So 80s playlists, ahoy again. Then working together, you define the group's hideout, which could be someone's room or a tree house or whatever. You know the kind of thing, kids' dens. And then you answer the Games Master's questions. So we have archetypes. Bookworm, computer geek, these should all be familiar from teen films and series from the 80s and nostalgic ones from today. Hicks, jocks, popular kids, rockers, troublemakers, weirdos. That goes into the age, luck points, the various attributes, body, technology, heart, mind. You have to put at least 1 in each attribute, and 5 is the maximum. When you get older, you get to spend extra points. Your luck, which allows you to re-roll. Your various skills, so you've got sneak, force, move, tinker, program, calculate, contact, charm, lead, investigate, comprehend, empathize. Obviously there's very little emphasis on combat, these being kids, though kids get into scuffles, so yeah. Your iconic item, it's just something that says something about who you are, and it gives you bonuses when it can be used. So yeah, pick something useful, I guess. There's a bit of room for exploitation there, but these things happen. Your problem is just something. Maybe you're horribly bullied. Who knows? You have some kind of issue that you're working through. Maybe you're in love with a girl who doesn't notice that you exist. Teenage problems. Pride is something that makes you feel strong and powerful, like my dad can beat up your dad or whatever. Your anchor is a person you can go to for support, comfort or care. Older brother, older sister, parent, uncle, grandparent, whatever. You can't die, but you can suffer from conditions. So you try to overcome trouble and fail, or if you push a dice roll, which I don't remember what the rule for that is, we'll get to that. You can be forced to take a condition. So you could be upset, scared, exhausted or injured when you fail to deal with trouble. And that creates penalties on your dice rolls, which aren't that great anyway. We'll get to that in a sec. Experience points can be spent to raise your character. At the end of a session you get some XP. Those can be used to raise things. 5 points to raise a skill by 1 level. 5 is the maximum. There you go. So because you're limited to 3 in skills, you've got room to grow. I would probably allow that to go to 4 during character creation for kids who really want to specialise, and then that would still leave you a little bit of room to grow. Hideouts, yeah, like I said, dens or attics or rooms or whatever. It just gives you some way to bring all your characters together, along with the relationships that you put together with the other kids. So, groups tend to hang out together, right? So I used to hang out with the weirdos, freaks and nerds. That was my gang. So trouble is situations and how you deal with them. You add your stat to your skill, you roll that number of 6-sided dice. Everyone that comes up as 6 is a success. Now that doesn't feel particularly good to me. It means when you do get into trouble, most of the time I don't think you're guaranteed much of a success, and it doesn't really measure like degrees of success particularly. You're unlikely to get a success unless you have 6 dice, basically, then you should succeed most of the time. And this is something that you would be pretty good at. You know, a 3 in a stat, 3 in a skill should succeed much of the time. Certainly running some test rolls and so on. It doesn't feel... failure can drive a game, but it feels to me that there's too much failure. So maybe I would add in an extra bonus dice, or do something else to make it a little bit easier, a little bit better. It's just as things stand, it feels like nothing interesting or exciting happens. You just tend to fail, and I don't like that very much. It just feels somewhat off. Now you can modify that. You can spend luck, and that lets you re-roll all the failed dice without needing to push yourself, which can create conditions, and you get your luck points back after each play session. So yeah, that allows you to re-roll. That can make a difference, but that's a limited commodity. Yeah, if you're 10, you can only do that 5 times. If you're 15, you can't do it at all. And yeah, if things are more difficult, you need more successes, which we're verging on the nearly impossible, even if the difficulty just goes to 2. Right? If you do get extra successes on top of the ones you need, you can spend those extra 6s to get additional useful positive effects, right? And you get to sort of semi-freely dictate what those are. If you fail, you get into trouble. So the other thing I would do is make the rolls really sparing and only do them when you need to. Maybe set a threshold of stat plus skill and allow an automatic success on things where their stat plus skill is over that. Like, I don't know, if you've got tech of 3 and computer programming of 3, say, okay, you want to write a basic program to do X, Y, or Z. Fine, you don't need to roll for that. Maybe, you know, something like that. For everyday stuff that not everyone can do, but that your character is competent in. Maybe avoid rolls if you can. Would be one way to go about it. You can push rolls by pushing yourself physically or mentally. You can only do this once. You describe what you're doing to push yourself, and you take a condition that fits, and then you re-roll all the dice except those showing 6s. So it's like spending luck, but you're pushing yourself, so you can exhaust yourself, which makes everything else in the future more difficult, of course. So yeah, they do have a table here of the chances to succeed on the base dice, and if you push, what your chance to succeed is. That looks better than it actually feels during play. There's an ineffable thing when it comes to mechanics where you can feel competent or not competent, or the success rates can feel right or not right. And whatever the bull statistics are, the feel is almost more important. Dice pools, such as this game has, have a way of making you feel competent if you're picking up lots of dice and rolling them. But the required level of success in this that doesn't make it feel right. Maybe dropping it to 5 or 6. The trouble is that would make it too easy, I think. But that works for board games. They tend to go for 5 or 6 as a base. So that might be worth considering. Or maybe instead of using the difficulties here, have a normal difficulty being 4, 5, or 6. An extremely difficult roll being 5 or 6, and an almost impossible roll being 6 would be another way to look at it. Though again, I think you'd need to tweak a lot to make that work. Then they've got versus rolls and extended problems. Yeah, just the basics. It's a bit skimpy, but you know, it's a very strongly narrative game, so you don't need a great deal of detail. The skills are all very broad. We've talked about most of them. Sneak, force, move, tinker, program, calculate, contact, charm, lead, investigate, comprehend, empathize. Yeah, they're all very broad kid type skills. So the system's not going to cope particularly well with adults, but then adults are more a kind of narrative tool than anything else in this. Fairly good Games Master section here, talking about mysteries, how they interact with real life, conflicts, plenty of examples, which is always nice to see, both in the main text and in the sidebars. So there's plenty of inspiration and plot hooks and story seeds here. General overview on how to run these things. This section could have actually done with being maybe half again as long, with more examples, more explanations, going into problems that can turn up. But overall, it's a pretty good guide on how to create interactions and stories, and how things can progress, and how you can get around the players not finding the clues that you want. It uses mind maps, which is something that I advocate for. You know, figure out who has interacted with the story, what information that they have, map it all out as best you can, and then improvise the rest. It's a happy compromise between heavy prep games and low prep games. This game shouldn't need much in the way of prep. Just brainstorm, slap out on a piece of paper all the interactions and aspects of the mystery that you can, and then allow the players to work through it. And that is the way I Games Master almost all the time. In any case, I just kind of let things happen. Some games are heavier prep than others, and but I always seem to have less fun with those than when I can improvise or feed off what the players are doing. But this is gold, but it's a very short section, unfortunately, and I think that's where the real value of this book comes in, is in these ideas and mind maps and brainstorming and tips and hooks and things like that. But it's a very small part of the game, unfortunately. Then we have some examples and some sketches. Then we get into the sort of specific location. So we've got that for the Swedish setting. I can't really go into this because spoilers, really. But you're always going to end up making the game your own, so I question exactly how useful that is, and I always question how useful example adventures are. It can show how you intend a game to be played, but it's material that can mostly only be used once, which is why whenever I do put out adventures, I tend to supplement them with other useful material that can be used longer term, right? And adventures just seem like a waste to me, almost. And unfortunately, this is the major drawback of the book. From page 99 all the way through, this is all a preset campaign, a preset adventure. Yeah, it's all, almost all, one-shot information. And that's just, it's not something you get reuse out of, it's not something you get useful play out of. I mean, some of it, I guess the maps, some of the NPCs you could use over and again, some of the encounters, it does give you examples of how the rules might work here and there, how the clues tie together, but this is all adventure stuff. All of it. Yeah, there's a whole campaign in here, and that's, yeah, we're still going, right? So we started on page 99, call it 100. We're now on 154, 156, 159, 161. And it's all adventure, all adventure, all adventure. Still going, still adventure stuff. And yeah, and then there's the thanks and the index. All right, but nigh on. Here we are, page 191. Nearly half the book is adventure and campaign. Right? that is a huge amount of a book to put in one-use material. And what's this retail for? 30, 40 quid, and half of it is one-use adventure material. That is a huge minus for me to this book, because just put it out separately and in softcover, and keep your main book at around 100 pages, maybe 110 if you cull the useful material from the adventures, and put it out separately. And then your core book could have been probably not as low as 15, but 20 quid, hardback, full colour, and people would be more likely to pick that up. Yeah, it was expensive, and I did wait for a good deal before I got it. But when half your book is one-shot material, there's very little value for money there, however much value there is in the rest of the book. So that pissed me off. So, style. There is no getting away from the fact that Simon's art is absolutely fantastic. I mean, it is the selling point of the game. It's just a pity that the choice of paper to print on, the colour process and so on, does not show Simon's work to its fullest and best extent. So look his stuff up online. If it had been on proper photo paper, I would have given it a 5 out of 5 for style. The overall design style is fairly minimalist. I like it. I think it's suitable. I can't give it the full 5 because of the choice of printing paper. So 4 out of 5 for style. In terms of substance, it's light, but that's fine. So I would have given it a 4 out of 5 for substance, but half the book is material you can never use again, really. And that is hugely wasteful, and it's not substantial in RPG terms. So I'm going to have to put that at a 2, unfortunately. So 2 out of 5 for substance, which gives it a total of 6 out of 10 or 3 out of 5. So yeah, above average. If it wasn't for all that wasted space, I would unreservedly give it a 4, even 5 out of 5 total, particularly if it had been printed on photo paper, and if you'd halved the book, that would have been cheaper as well. So you take it for what it is. Maybe pick up the PDF instead, because frankly the quality of the art is going to be better if you can handle reading on a screen or a tablet or whatever. And in that instance, because it's cheaper and because the representation of the art will be better, then it would easily score a 4 out of 5 in terms of grim points. But there you go. Zang.